What's up, y'all? Welcome to the Nerdy Professor podcast, where we talk about everything black, bold, and beautiful. I'm your host, the Nerdy Professor. What do y'all know about Canada's role in World War I? Better yet, what do y'all know about black Canadians who fought in the war? Today, we're going to take a look at the role that black Canadians played during the war. But first, let's talk about some anime. In 86, yes, the name of the anime is 86, the world is divided into two factions. In one corner, we have the powerful and privileged Legion, who lived in the capital cities, and in the other corner, we have the marginalized 86, the outcast, who were used as expendable soldiers to fight in an endless war. The 86 are not seen as human beings by those they protect. They are treated as lesser, as disposable tools. Despite their lives being considered as expendable by society, the 86 soldiers continue to fight, demanding recognition in their role in the war, as well as their humanity. This system of oppression in 86 is similar to the experiences of black Canadians during World War I. The black soldiers who fought were, in a way, treated as 86 soldiers, facing prejudice and discrimination not only within Canadian society, but within the military. Like the 86, they were not able to serve as equal soldiers alongside their white counterparts. The very act of fighting for a country that didn't recognize their equality and humanity was, in itself, an act of resistance. In both cases, these soldiers' lives were viewed as less valuable than others. In 86, there is a constant struggle to prove that the 86 soldiers are more than the labels society has placed on them. The show highlights how the society that dehumanized them is ultimately threatened by their strength and humanity. This parallels the black Canadian soldiers in their fight to prove their worth and demand their recognition as equal citizens. Much like 86, who are misunderstood and rejected, black soldiers faced a similar battle against a system that sought to erase their humanity. In both narratives, the soldiers are united by their defiance in the face of a system that wants to ostracize them. Their struggles, though separated by time and space, are interconnected by the same themes of resistance, identity, and unyielding drive for recognition. There's a perfect scene that illustrates this point. If y'all remember the scene from early on in the anime where one of the 86 was yelling at the handler for not even asking their names. This show is high-key like Game of Thrones. You cannot get connected to a single character. Okay, so let's tie this into the historical context of black Canadians during World War I. So World War I, aka the war to end all wars, was a worldwide conflict, hence the name, that lasted from 1914 to 1918. It mostly included the Allied powers, France, Britain, Russia, and later the US. On the other side, we have the Central Powers led by Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. The war was sparked by the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary, but it was fueled by a mix of nationalism, imperialism, and military alliances, and a competition between European powers. The war saw the introduction of new technology, including tanks, airplanes, and chemical weapons, which Canada found out about the hard way. And the war was marked by brutal trench warfare. It led to massive loss of life and dramatically reshaped the political landscape of Europe, eventually setting the stage for World War II. What's interesting though is the many angles people can take when looking at World War I. In this instance, let's briefly talk about Canada in this war. On August 4th, 1914, Great Britain entered the war to end all wars, which automatically put Canada in the mix because they were still a British Dominion. For the most part, Canadians were down for the cause, except for the French-speaking side. Quebec opposed conscription because they believed that their allegiance was to Canada, not France or Britain, and this divide would only worsen as the war went on, but that's a story for another time. Nevertheless, in October of 1914, 31,000 of 100,000 Canadian men who volunteered marched off to war. They would later be known as Canada's Answer. I'm not gonna lie to you, that's a pretty cool name. Canada would go on to fight fiercely in the war. The Canadian Expeditionary Force, aka CEF, sent 425,000 soldiers to Europe, with the Canadian Corps becoming a key front on the Western Front. They earned a reputation for their effectiveness, particularly during the last 100-day offensive in 1918, where they engaged 25% of the German army. contributing to the ultimate defeat of the Central Powers. While Canada as a whole contributed greatly, it's crucial to recognize the experience of Black Canadians who faced both racism and resistance as they volunteered to serve their country. Black Canadians were not treated as Canada's answer. When it came to entering the war, they were, in all intents and purposes, barred from fighting in the war. For example, 50 men from Sydney, Nova Scotia banded together in an effort to join the military, but were turned away due to racial discrimination and given answers like "this is a white man's war." The widespread rejection of Black volunteers underscored the systemic racism that saturated every aspect of Canadian society during this era. The sentiment of "we don't want you in the white man's war" would kind of come to an end in 1916, largely thanks to determined efforts of Black leaders and community activists who lobbied for the inclusion of Black soldiers. Figures like George Morton, a civil rights advocate and community leader from Hamilton, Ontario, courageously challenged the racial barriers to enlistment. Morton wrote the Minister of Militia and Defense, Sir Sam Hughes, in 1915, questioning the discriminatory practices that kept Black Canadians from serving. Morton's letter was one of many efforts to call attention to the inequality faced by Black Canadians in the military and highlighted their readiness to fight for their nation. Similarly, Arthur Alexander, a respected community leader from North Buxton, voiced his frustration with the denial of Black Canadians' rights to serve. In 1914, he took his concerns to the public, advocating for racial equality in military service. Alexander's actions resonated with many in the Black community, who were eager to demonstrate their loyalty to Canada but were blocked by systemic racism. In addition to these efforts, Reverend William A. White played a central role in advocating for Black Canadians in the military. Reverend White's leadership was a beacon of hope for Black soldiers, an example of dedication and persistence in the fight for equality. Reverend White became a symbol of resistance against racial discrimination within the military. His deep belief in justice and equality inspired many in the Black Canadian community to continue pushing for the right to serve. Through the collective efforts of the Black community, they were able to convince the Canadian government to authorize the creation of the No. 2 Construction Battalion in 1916, marking the first significant step toward integrating Black Canadians into the military. The discourse surrounding Black Canadians' right to serve in the military focused on several key themes that reflected both their sense of duty and their desire for equality. Patriotism and duty were at the core of the conversation. Despite the racial discrimination they faced, many Black Canadians felt a deep loyalty to their country and were eager to contribute to the war effort. They wanted to prove their dedication and show that they were just as capable as their white counterparts. Equal rights was another central theme. Black Canadians argued that as a citizen, they were entitled to the same rights and opportunities as any other Canadian, including the right to serve in the military. Additionally, Black Canadian newspapers played a pivotal role in stimulating racial consciousness. Editors like J.R.B. Whitney of the Canadian Observer and Wilfred A. DaCosta of the Atlantic Advocate were particularly influential in promoting a sense of community among Black Canadians. This sense of collective strength fueled the creation of the No. 2 Battalion and was a key factor in advancing the cause of Black Canadians during the war. The No. 2 Construction Battalion, formed on July 5, 1916, was the largest Black military unit in Canadian history. The No. 2 Battalion's work was crucial to the Allied war effort. These men, often working under dangerous conditions, supported the front lines by moving supplies, constructing vital infrastructure, and maintaining railroads. They were also instrumental in timber production, helping the Canadian Forestry Corps cut and transport wood used for building trenches, observation posts, and other critical structures. Despite being excluded from direct combat, the No. 2 Battalion's work helped sustain the military's operation and contributed to the overall success of the Allies. Black Canadian soldiers demonstrated grit in the face of racial discrimination. Even within the military, they faced segregation in living arrangements, medical facilities, and uniforms. They were often assigned inferior supplies and equipment, which affected their ability to perform effectively. These ongoing acts of discrimination stood in stark contrast to the soldiers' courage, and yet they persisted. Despite the adversity they faced, Black Canadian soldiers served honorably and made remarkable contributions during World War I. At least 350 Black Canadians were drafted into the Canadian Expeditionary Force, with a few managing to serve on the front lines during the 100 Days campaign. When conscription was introduced in 1917, the treatment of Black Canadians in the military system was further complicated. As we said earlier, many black men were initially rejected for volunteer service, so the sudden demand for conscription left many feeling resentful. Many of these men were forced into military service under the Military Service Act, often against their will. For those who had been turned away earlier due to racial prejudice, the conscription policy felt like an ironic twist of fate. Still, the majority of black Canadians complied with the act and registered for service as required. This mixed reactions to conscriptions highlights the tensions and frustrations black soldiers faced throughout the war. World War I was also a battlefield on the home front, with women taking up the reins and roles that were traditionally off limits to them. They would begin working in factories and office jobs near the front lines as nurses, and even in hospitals. Even though positions like those were mostly given to white women, black women were not left behind. Despite facing significant racial and gender-based discrimination, black Canadian women played an essential role in supporting the war effort and caring for their communities at home. Black women across Canada were at the forefront of fundraising and volunteering initiatives. They raised funds to support hospitals, soldiers, and various wartime projects. These women worked tirelessly, sewing and assembling packages filled with items like pillows, sheets, socks, and scarves, all of which were sent to soldiers fighting overseas. In this way, they ensured that their contributions were felt both at home and on the front lines. Another area where black women's contributions were essential was in supporting the families of soldiers who had gone overseas. Wives, mothers, and sweethearts faced immense hardships during the war, and black Canadian women stepped up to provide them with the support they needed, from emotional encouragement to practical assistance. Health education also became one of the most important contributions black Canadian women made during this time. Perhaps the most significant and organized efforts of black Canadian women during the war was the creation of the Black Cross Nurses, aka the BCN. The BCN, which was inspired by the structure of the Red Cross, was founded as an answer to the exclusion of black women from formal nursing programs. At a time when black women were barred from entering most Canadian nursing schools, the BCN provided an essential service for black communities who had long been neglected in terms of health access. Though the BCN would not formally be established until after the war, the groundwork was laid during the conflict. Black Canadian women, seeing the need for healthcare services, took matters into their own hands. Many traveled to the US to receive training, like Bernice Redmond, who later returned to Canada to provide medical care and health education. These pioneering women would eventually form local chapters, modeling their structure after the Red Cross. Through the BCN's initiatives, things like nutrition, maternity care, and childcare to mothers in their communities were taught. This improved the immediate health and well-being of black families, and also helped raise the overall standard of living in marginalized communities, providing critical services that were often neglected by the government. So at this point, the end of the war is upon us. Canada's military success in battles like Vimy Ridge, Passchendaele, and the Battle of Amiens, as well as its role in breaking the Hindenburg Line, solidified its reputation as a key fighting force in the war. However, the war came at a high cost. Nearly 61,000 Canadians were lost during this war, including Private George Lawrence Price, who fell just minutes before the armistice. RIP, fam. Politically, Canada gained independence on the global stage. Prime Minister Robert Borden secured Canada's separate representation at the 1919 Versailles Peace Conference, and Canada signed the Treaty of Versailles on its own. This shift marked Canada's move from a British dominion to a more autonomous nation, further strengthened by the Statute of Westminster in 1931, and it fostered a growing sense of Canadian identity that distanced the country from Britain and aligned it more closely with the US. The story of the No. 2 Construction Battalion doesn't end. Their post-war experience became a bitter reminder of the injustices they had long endured, even after proving their loyalty while fighting for Canada. The No. 2 Construction Battalion's post-war experience was the lack of recognition for their service. The battalion was officially disbanded September 15, 1920, with no ceremony and no recognition of their vital contribution to Canada's war effort. Despite their crucial role in supporting the operations that helped sustain the military effort, they were effectively erased from the official narratives of Canada's wartime history. Their bravery on the battlefield seemed to be forgotten as soon as they returned home. As if the injustice of their disbandment wasn't enough, Black Canadian veterans faced severe racial discrimination upon their return. The barriers they faced were numerous. They struggled to find employment, were often denied equal treatment, and found it nearly impossible to reintegrate into civilian life on equal footing with their white peers. Black Canadian veterans faced alienation, prejudice, and neglect in the country they call home. The story of Black Canadians in World War I is a historical account with a powerful reflection of the ongoing struggle for racial justice and recognition. For years, Black Canadians were denied the right to serve, then sidelined in non-combat roles and treated as second-class citizens, despite their willingness to fight for their country. But their sacrifices sparked crucial conversation about civil rights and equality, which eventually led to some undoing of discriminatory barriers. Today, those same issues of racial injustice are front and center. The fight for equality in Canada is about ensuring that marginalized groups like Black Canadians are recognized, celebrated, and acknowledged for their contributions to the nation's history. This includes formal apologies and reparations. In 2021, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau issued an official apology to Black Canadians for their exclusion from the military during World War I, acknowledging the historical wrongs they faced and the legacy of discrimination that continues to affect the community. This apology and the ongoing push for recognition highlight the growing movement to right the wrongs of the past. The contribution of Black Canadians both in the military and beyond are finally being recognized in meaningful ways. In conclusion, World War I was a pivotal moment for Black Canadians. Despite facing systemic racism, Black Canadians' resilience and sacrifice helped shape Canada's path toward independence and laid the foundation for a more inclusive national identity. Alright y'all, that's it. Thank you for coming. I hope you learned something. If you enjoyed this episode, please drop a like, a comment, and subscribe for more of your favorite anime-infused Black history. Until next time, peace.